Fine. All right, if you got a Bible with you, you can open up to the book of John, chapter 18. We've got 2 weeks left in our series looking at Jesus as I am. And so we got this week in John. Next week we're going to be in Revelation, the end of Revelation, actually, when Jesus says, I'm the Alpha and Omega. But for today, chapter 18 of John, verse 1, we read, it says this. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew that place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, Whom do you seek? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he. Say a better translation is, I am. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, Whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he, so if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? So that's our text for this morning. There are several things that I want to deal with out of this text. The first is this: I want to deal with Jesus and this garden. So one of the things that we know is Jesus operated on a different level than you and I did, right? And the reason that I say that isn't because he was not truly human, but because he was the perfect expression of what it means to be truly human, right? And we could say correctly that he was truly man and he was truly God. In his humanity, he never sinned, and he, I think it's fair to say, operated on a level that you and I will not operate on, right? And yet, even Jesus, who is perfect, still removed himself regularly to rest and to pray. How do we know that? Verse 2, he met with his disciples in this garden often, right? This was their place. How do we know that? Even Judas knew about it, but the guards didn't know about it, right? So this was their place where they came to refresh, where they came to pray, where they came to spend time together. And so then let me suggest this to you. If even Jesus needed to refresh and to spend time in prayer, what does that tell us? That we probably need to have that same kind of place, that same kind of idea, that same kind of program built into our lives as well. And so we can shake our heads and be like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Now let me ask you a question. Where's the place? Where's your place? Where's the place that you escape to? Where's the place that you go to pray? Where's the place that you go to rest and to refresh and to debrief from work and life and ministry? And then the question is, how often do you find yourself there? Because listen, like I don't know about you, but pretty consistently people will be like, hey, how's it going? And my response is, man, I'm tired. Right? Like, I'm tired. Work is busy. My kids are in stuff that's never ending. There are literally always dishes to do, right? Thank God for the rain, but now my grass is growing, more like my dandelions are growing, and I've actually got to mow my lawn regularly, right? Like, there is no end to the things that need to be done. And what I find is, as I'm tired, when I get a moment It's far easier for me to numb my brain at the end of the day by scrolling YouTube or Facebook or maybe reading a book, playing a video game. Right? And it's not that there's anything intrinsically wrong with those things, but I often find myself turning to them to be refreshed and to be strengthened rather than going to the place to pray and to commune with the Father. Right, so I ask again, where is your place? If you don't have one, can I suggest that you find one? And that you take hold of the community that God offers and find refreshment in Him. Right? And I don't want to stretch the text too far, but I do think it's interesting that we see Jesus going to a garden where He has community with God, because what does that remind us of? Another garden, another time where someone had community with God. This place of being removed and finding a restoration of what it is to have community with God. We need that in our lives. Right, so then, as we talk about the garden, we can switch and talk about the people who we see in the garden. Specifically, Jesus, Judas, and Peter. So let's start with Jesus. Jesus has just finished what we call the high priestly prayer. So if you take our text, you turn it back a page, or you look before, you're going to get chapter 17. You'll see this highlight, Jesus' high priestly prayer. And the Coles notes of what's going on in that prayer is that he is praying for those that the Father has given him, which are those who know the Father through the Son. He notes that they are in the world, but says, hey, I'm leaving the world. And he realizes that the world hated them because they are not of the world. So then he asks the Father for continued sanctification or cleansing, and ultimately notes that this sanctification, this cleansing will happen as they hear his word and through his consecration. Right? So what we see from this is Jesus knows what's coming down the pipe. He knows he's going to the cross. He knows he's going to the Father. He knows he's leaving the disciples behind. And at the same time, even knowing all of that, he walks straight towards it, asking the Father to care for his people, to keep them, to sanctify them, because they believe. And what this tells us, what this shows us, is actually something about the nature of Jesus. Right? While he, in this prayer, recognizes the fact that he's going to be glorified in all of this, his concern is for his people. Some of you need to hear this morning. Jesus cares for you. Jesus has made provision for you. Jesus has taken your needs to the Father. He washes you with his word and his consecration, which means his sacrificial death. Right? And so while I will have no shame about railing on the self-help or the self-empowerment gospel that says, man, you're just so awesome, you can do it, Jesus has got your back, I have at the same time zero problem proclaiming Jesus is looking out for you if you are his. Had the chance a couple of weeks ago to help out with a VBS for some of the younger grades at Mountain Christian School a few weeks ago. And I probably drove them nuts because there was a script on what I was supposed to talk about, and every day I came and I was like, this isn't great, I'm going to do something different. It'll be similar though, right? But I remember we were talking about some of these things about how God cares for you, and one of the illustrations we talked about was this idea of siblings, right? And in one sense, when you look at the scriptures, Jesus really is, for all of those who believe, a big brother, right? He's the first son of the Father and brings many children to the Father. So in one sense, at least, Jesus is the big brother. And I remember talking with these kids at MCS, and I'm an oldest sibling, right? And best sibling. Oldest is best, right? That's how that works. We also have the middleest, and then nobody remembers the middle child, right? Youngest and then middle, however that works. Anyways, I just triggered so many people. It's great. Right? But I remember saying, I would at times like mess with my brother and my sister, right? We didn't always get along, and I wasn't always the kindest older brother. I ruled with a, iron fist. I have red hair. I should tell you everything you should need to know about my temperament. But here's the thing. While I could kind of jack with my brother and my sister and push them around a little bit, if anybody else did, gloves came off, right? Because that's my family, and I look out for them. Now, Jesus is perfect. Jesus didn't have red hair, doesn't have the temperament, right? So he's not jacking with his little brothers and sisters. He's looking out for them all the time. And we see in this high priestly prayer that Jesus is looking out for those who are his. And the way that he does this is by laying down his life, and specifically by drinking the cup the Father has given him, right? We see Jesus say this when Peter cuts off the guy's ear. He's like, hey, put the sword away. I have to drink this cup. So then the question is, well, what on earth does that mean? And I'll say this. Some phrases have certain connotations, right? So if I were to say, I've got broad shoulders, you would all know what I mean. My wife would laugh, but you'd still all know what I mean, right? In Judaistic thought, the cup referred to the wrath of God against unrighteousness. Right? So let me read you a couple of scriptures. Isaiah 51:17 says this, wake yourself, stand up, O Jerusalem. You who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, who have drunk to the dregs the bowl, the cup of staggering. Jeremiah 25:15. Thus the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup of the wine of wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. They shall drink and stagger and be crazed because of the sword that I am sending among them. Then Revelation 14:9-10. If anyone worships the beast in its image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. So what we see happening is the God who is, according to Exodus 34, merciful and gracious and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness and keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, is also, in the same passage, the God who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So God, who is merciful, loving, and forgiving, also is God who deals with unrighteousness and injustice. Both end. See, the problem that we run into, though, is that our definitions of unrighteousness and injustice are often different than God's. So especially in a Western society, we don't love the idea that God would pour out his wrath on people like us. Right? This is one of the first things that you will run into that people will object to when talking about Christianity. So let's consider a few truths here. First is this. All of us sin, which is a rejection of God's kingship over creation. Right? So Jesus, God is king over creation. When we sin, we are rejecting his kingship, and we are saying, there is another king. Right? Either we're saying, I'm king. Or maybe we're saying, this relationship over here is king. Or maybe we say, my kids are king. Or maybe we say, pornography is king. Or adultery is king. Or money is king. Or gender definitions are king. Or sports are king. Or reputation is king. Or whatever my self-medicating habit is king. And in saying that, what we're saying is that this world revolves around that thing or that person. And if that thing or that person is glorified and satisfied, then everything will be right in the world. And in doing that, we commit cosmic and eternal treason. Because we are looking at the God of the universe who is intrinsically, eternally worthy and valuable and king. And we say, God, you are not king. You are not the one who sets things right. You are not the one who deserves to be glorified. This thing over here is. And the problem is I don't think we wrap our minds around how perverse that type of a substitution is. How much destruction that kind of a substitution leads to. Where when we substitute something else as king in our lives, it destroys us, it destroys those around us, it destroys God's creation, and it leads to death. And so God, in his mercy, grace, abounding love, and steadfast faithfulness is slow to anger, but man, sin does make him angry. And he does act against it. And the imagery in the scriptures isn't a slap on the wrist. It is a drinking of the cup of his wrath. In creation, Romans 8 says, groans for this to happen, for things to be set right. Okay, so at this point, if you're doing the math, you'd be like, man, that doesn't sound real good. Because scripturally, we see that God's right wrath has been, is at times being, and in the future will be poured out against those who harbor it, which is all of us. We deserve to drink the cup of God's wrath because we commit cosmic treason. We declare other things king. But then we come back to our text, and who's drinking the cup? Jesus is the one drinking the cup. And listen to me, that's your cup to drink. That's my cup to drink. You're the sinner, I'm the sinner, but Jesus drinks the cup. This is what we call substitutionary atonement. 2 Corinthians 5:21. God made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we would become the righteousness of God. Jesus drinks the cup. We become the righteousness of God through Jesus, what he calls his consecration. How? By believing. By being sanctified through Christ and through his word. Listen to me, and this is where we come to Jesus' statement of divinity, our I am statement for this morning. It's not like Jesus was forced to do this. When the soldiers come to him and Jesus asks, who do you seek? What does he say? Right? They're like, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. His response is, I am. And what happens? They are all knocked over. It's not like Jesus didn't have an out here. And yet he drinks the cup on our behalf willingly. As the God who thousands of years before spoke to Abraham, told him his name and said, I am. He comes, he fulfills his promises. He is the one who restores our relationship with God. Jesus drinks the cup. So then we see our second character person in the garden, and that's Judas. Judas was a disciple, in line to be what we now call an apostle. Judas saw the signs, Judas heard the teaching, Judas walked with Jesus, like actually Jesus, for 3 years. Took communion. He was at the Lord's Supper when it was instituted. And he betrayed Jesus. And so let's just get this in our heads because it's probably true. Have you ever been betrayed by the person that you least expect it from? And what betrayals hurt the most? The people we trust the most. Now, let me follow this through. Is there any chance that you are the person, the one that you may not suspect, who is in line to be the Judas? Right? Because it's easy to be like, oh man, this person over here, this person over there, or Judas was such a dummy, why didn't he get it? I think what we need to be careful to do is to look at and say, where's that me? Maybe you've seen the signs, maybe you've heard the teaching, maybe you've broke the bread and drank from the cup of communion, but are you his? Like when push comes to shove, is he king or is something else? Right? And as much as we love to fill ourselves into the role of the hero in biblical stories, I think we are better off considering how often we have way more in common with the villains, way more in common with the people who lack faith, way more in common with the Pharisees, way more in common with the Sadducees, way more in common with, take your pick. What we need to do is we need to recognize that Jesus is the hero of the story. He's the hero. He's the one we need to turn to, and we need to allow him to transform our hearts and to keep us so that we don't follow our Judas hearts into betrayal, saying something else is king. Then we turn to our third person in the garden, which is Peter. I feel a little bit like Peter is Brick from Anchorman, which is probably a reference I shouldn't make. Brick killed a man with a trident. Peter cut off a dude's ear with a sword. Probably lay low for a couple days, right? Peter is committed to Jesus. But Peter also doesn't always, even post-resurrection, filled with the Spirit, get what Jesus is about. And there's two ends to this. First is, as disciples, man, we need to be careful to understand what Jesus is actually about. I could go on tangent after tangent after tangent about how Christians miss what Jesus is about. Man, in Western evangelicalism, take your pick. But what we need to know is, man, we have got to be careful to understand what he is about. And the way that we understand what he is about is by, through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, getting into the scriptures, spending time in prayer, immersing ourselves in Christian community. And I'd say as well, finding the place. And the second thing that we should do with this is we should be so thankful that God is gracious when we're giant dummies. Right? Peter cut off a dude's ear. He denied Christ 3 times. But, unlike Judas, he belonged to Jesus. And Jesus watches out for his own. So track with me for a minute. I just finished up a course. It's a week-long intensive course on divine kingship. And so one of the things you do in a divine kingship course is you look at the kings in Israel's history especially. And one of the things that we saw time after time after time after time again is most of the kings in both Judah and Israel's history were not that great. Even David, who is like the guy when it comes to kings, man, he had a jacked up life. He was not a good father. You look at his family was a disaster. David committed murder, right? Like you could begin to pull out these things. David was not always what we would consider a good dude. And yet God calls him, what? A person, a man after my own heart. See, the thing that set David apart, because you're going to find later on there are lots of kings who maybe didn't do all that great, and yet they were rejected by God. The thing that set David apart was he had a heart after God. I might be so bold as to say he believed. And in that, he belonged to God. We could transcend covenants here a little bit and say he belonged to Christ. We should be very thankful that God is incredibly gracious, that when we are his, He keeps us. Man, that's not a justification to be a dummy, right? But that is an encouragement that when we blow it, He is there and He is faithful. So then what do we do with all of this? Well, we pull it all together and we say, the I am, made incarnate, Jesus Christ, drinks the cup of wrath that we should have had to drink. The question is, will we believe? Will we belong to Him? Or will we follow another king? Will we set ourselves up as king and ultimately put our trajectory towards death and drinking the cup that He drank for us instead of allowing Him to take it? See, at the end of the day, we are called to a community with God that recognizes His kingship, that recognizes His sacrifice, and that calls us to believe and to belong. Let's pray. So God, we thank You for Your Son, Jesus. We recognize that it's not anything that we do that restores relationship with You, but that is everything Jesus has done that restores relationship with You. God, I pray this morning as we even reflect on Your word, that we would be able to reflect on where we really are. God, that we would see the Judas tendencies in our heart, that we would see the Peter tendencies in our heart, and that in the midst of that, we would turn constantly to You, Jesus. Knowing that we belong, and that we belong through belief, and that we are cleansed by You, by Your word, by Your life, Your death, and Your resurrection. Help us to be a people who cling to You, who proclaim Your kingship. We ask this all in Jesus' precious and holy name. Amen. Amen. Friends, this morning we're just going to let you go. I want us to be able to chew on that, and I also want you to be able to chew on some baked goods. So be blessed. Love you so much, and we'll see you soon.